Hello, and welcome back to another horror story. Today we'll be reading the Dunwich Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. Feel free to get yourself a tea, a blanket, or something to make you less scared, for this one is a very long, dreadful story. So let's dive right into it. Gorgons and hydras and chimeras, dire stories of Caladan and the Harpies, may reproduce themselves in the brain of superstition, but they were there before. They are transcript types, the archetypes in us, and internal. How else should the recital of that which we know, in a wicked sense to be false, come to affect us at all? Is it that we naturally conceive terror from such objects considered in the capacity of being able to inflict upon us bodily injury? Or least of all, these terrors are of older stand. They date beyond body, or without the body. They would have been the same. That's the kind of fire here, treated and purely spiritual, that is strong in proportion as it is objectless on earth, that it penetrates in the period of our sinless infancy, our difficulties of the solution of which affords some probable insight into our anti-mundane condition, and a peep at least into the shadowlands of pre-existence, Charles Lamb, witches, and other night fears. Chapter 1. When a traveler in north-central Massachusetts takes the wrong fork at the junction of the Owlsbury Pike, just beyond Dean's Corners, he comes upon a lonely and curious country. The ground gets higher, and the briar-border stone walls press closer against the ruts of the dusty, curving road. The trees of the frequent forest belt seem too large, and the wild weeds, brambles, and grasses attain a luxuriance not often found in settled regions. At the same time, the planted fields appear singularly few and barren, while the sparsely scattered houses wear a surprisingly uniform aspect of age, squalor, and dilapidation. Without knowing why, one hesitates to ask directions from the gnarled, solitary figures spired now, then on crumbling doorsteps or on the sloping, rock-strewn meadows. Those figures are so silent and furtive that one feels somehow comforted by the forbidden things which it would be better to have nothing to do. When a rise in the road brings the mountains in view above the deep woods, the feeling of strange uneasiness is increased. The summits are too rounded and symmetrical to give a sense of comfort and naturalness, and sometimes the sky silhouettes with especial clearness the queer circles of tall stone pillars with which most of them are crowned. Gorges and ravines of problematic depth intersect the way, and the crude wooden bridges always seem of dubious safety. When the road dips again, there are stretches of marshstone that one instinctively dislikes, and indeed almost fears, at evening, when unseen whippoorwills chatter, and the fireflies come out in abnormal profusion to dance to the rationist's creepily insistent rhythms of stridently piping bullfrogs. The thinly shining line of the Mistopic's upper reaches has an oddly serpent-like suggestion as it winds close to the feet of the doomed hills, which it rises. As the hills show nearer, one heeds their wooded sides more than the stone-crowned tops. Those sides loom up so darkly and precipitously that one wishes that they would keep their distance. But there is no road by which to escape them. Across a covered bridge one sees a small village, huddled between the streams and the vertical slopes of round mountains, and wonders at the clusters of rotting grampled roofs, bespeaking an earlier architectural period than the neighboring region. It is not reassuring to see, on a closer glance, that most of the houses are deserted and failing to ruins. Then that a broken steepled church now harbors one solidly mercantile established of the hamlet. One dreads to trust the tremendous tunnel of the bridge, yet there is no way to avoid it. Once across, it is hard to prevent the imprecision of a faint malgin odor above the village, one that reeks as of mass mold and decay of centuries. And to follow the narrow road around the base of the hills and across the level of the country beyond till it rejoins the Absus Pike. Afterwards, one sometimes learns that one has been through Dunwich. Outsiders visit Dunwich as seldom as possible, and since a certain season of horror, all the signboards pointing towards it have been taken down. The scenery, judged by any ordinary aesthetic canon, is more than commonly beautiful, yet there is no influx of artists or summer tourists. 2 centuries ago, when the talk of witch blood and Satan worshippers in strange forest presence was not laughed at, it was custom to give reasons for avoiding the locality in our sensible age, since the Dunwich Horror of 1928 was hushed up by those who had the town and the world's welfare at heart. People shun it, without knowing exactly why. Perhaps one reason, though, it can apply to uniformed strangers, in that the natives are now repetitively decadent and have been gone far along the path of retrogression so commonly in way of New England's backwaters. They have come to form a race by themselves, which the well-defined mental and physical stigmata of degeneracy and inbreeding. The average of their intelligence is woefully low, whilst the animals reek of overt viciousness and half-hidden murders, incest, and the deeds of unnameable violence and perversity. The old gentry, representing the 2 or 3 ambigerous families which came from Salem in 1692, have kept somewhat above the general level of decay, though many branches are sunken into the sordid populace so deeply only their names remain as a key to the origin of their disgrace. Some of the whateleys and bishops still send their eldest sons to Harvard and Mistokonic, though their sons seldom return, in the moldering gambling roofs under which their ancestors were born. No one, even those who have the facts concerning the recent horror, can say just what is the matter with the Dunwich. Though old legend speaks of unhallowed rites and conclaves of the Indians, amidst where they are called forbidden shapes of shadows out of great rounded hills, and made wild organistic prayers that were answered by local cracklings and rumblings from the ground below in 1747, the revered Abbe Holdle, newly come to the Congregational Church of Dunwich Village, preached a memorial sermon on the close presence of Satan and his imps, in which he said, "It must be allowed that we blasphemies of eternal train of demons are matter of too common knowledge to deny it. The cursed voices of Azrael and Beelzebub and Baal and Belial being heard from now under the ground by above the score of credible witnesses now living, I myself, not more than a fortnight ago, catch a very plain discourse of evil powers in hills beyond my house, wherein were rattling and rolling, groaning, screeching and hissing, such as no thing of this earth could raise up, and which must needs to come back from the caves that only black magic can be discovered, and only the bell can unlock." Mr. Hoadley disappeared soon after delivering this sermon, but the text printed in Springfield is still extant. Noises in the hills continue to be reported from year to year, and still form a puzzle to geologists and physiographers. Other traditions tell of foul odors near the hill crowning circles of stone pillars, and of rushing airy presence to be heard faintly at certain hours from stated points at the bottom of the great ravines, while still others try to explain the Devil's Hop Yard, a bleak, blasted hillside where no tree, shrub, or grass blade will grow. Then, too, the natives are mortally afraid of numerous whipplepoles which grow vocal on warm nights. It is vowed that the birds are psychomps, lying in wait for the souls of the dying, and that their eerie cries in unison with the sufferer's struggling breath. If they can catch the fleeting soul when it leaves the body, they instantly flutter away, chiding in demonic laughter. But if they fail, they subside gradually into a disappointed silence. These tales, of course, are obsolete and ridiculed, because they come down from very old times. Dunwich is indeed ridiculously old, older by far than any communities within 30 miles of it. South of the village, one may still spy the cellar walls and chimney of the ancient bishop's house, which was built before the 1700s, while the ruins of the mill at the falls, built in 1806, form the most modern piece of architecture to be seen. Industry did not flourish here, and the 19th century factory movement proved short-lived. Oldest of all are the great rings of rough-hewn stone columns on the hilltops, but these are more greatly attributed to the Indians than to the settlers, deposited of skulls and bones found within these circles and around the sizable table, like rocks on Sentiment Hill, sustained to the popular belief that such spots were once the burial places of the Poctroons, even though many ethnologists would disagree, disregarding an absurd improbability of such a theory, persistent in believing the remains to be Caucasian. Chapter 2. It was in township of Dunwich, in a large and partly uninhabited farmhouse set against a hillside 4 miles from the village, and a mile and a half from any other dwelling, that Wilbur Whateley was born at 5 a.m. on Sunday, February 2nd, 1913. This date was recalled because it was Candlemas, which people in Dunwich curiously observe underneath another name, and because the noises in the hills had sounded, and all the dogs in the countryside had barked persistently throughout the night before. Less worthy of notice was the fact that Mother was in one of the decadent Whateleys, a somewhat deformed, unattractive albino woman of 35, living with an aged and half insane father, whom the most frightful tales of wizardry has been whispered in his youth. Lavigne Whateley had no known husband, but according to the custom of the region, made no attempts to disavow the child, concerning the other side of whose ancestry the country folk might and did not speculate as widely as they chose. On the contrary, she seemed strangely proud of the dark, goatish-looking infant who formed such a contrast to her own sickly and pink-eyed albinism, and was heard to mutter many curious prophecies about its unusual powers and tremendous future. Lavinia was one who would be apt to mutter such things, for she was a lone creature, given to wandering amidst thunderstorms in the hills and trying to read the great odorous books which her father had inherited 2 centuries of Whateleys, and which were falling to pieces with age and wormholes. She had never been to school, but was filled with disjoint scraps of ancient lore that old Whateleys had taught her. The remote farmhouse had always been feared because of old Whateley's reputation for black magic, and then unexplained death by violence of Mr. Whateley when Lavinia was 12 years old had not helped make the place popular. Isolated among strange influence, Lavinia was found and wild and ghastly daydreams and singular occupations, nor was her leisure much taken up by household cares in a home from which all standards of odor and cleanliness have long since disappeared. There was a hideous screaming which echoed even about the hill noise and the dogs barking on the night Wilbur was born, but no known doctor or midwife presided at his coming. Neighbors knew nothing of him till weeks after, when the old Whateleys drove his sleigh through the snow in Dunwich village and discoursed incoherently to the group of loafers at the Obstone's general store. There seemed to be a change in the old man, an added element of furtiveness in the clouded brain, which suddenly transformed him an object to a subject of fear. Though he was not one to be perturbed by any common family event, amidst it all he showed some traits of the pride later noticed in his daughter, and he said of the child's paternity was remembered by many of the hearers years afterwards. "I don't care what folks think when I lave his boy. Looked like his pa, but he wouldn't be nothing in his respect. Yet nothing thinks of only the folks and the folks hereabouts." Lavinia read some, and he said, "Something that the most of you won't even tell. I calculate her man is as good a husband as you can find this side of Ecclesbury if you ever knew him. As much about the hills I do, yet wouldn't as no better church will than know her. Let me tell you something. Some day you folks will hear our child of Lavinia calling its father's name on the top of Sentient Hill." The only person who saw Wilbur during the first month of his life were old Zacharian Waterleys of the Undercade Waterleys, the Earl Sawyer's common-law wife, Mammy Bishop. Mammy's visits were frankly one of curiosity, and her subsequent tales did justice to her observations. But Zachariah came to lead a pair of elderly cows, which old Whateley had brought on his son's courtesies, then marked the beginning of a course of cattle buying on the part of the small Wilbur's family, which ended only in 1928, when the Dunwich Horror came and went. Yet at no time did the ramshackle Whateley barn seem overcrowded with livestock. There came a period when people were curious enough to steal up and count the herd and graze precautiously on the steep hillside above the old farmhouse, and they could never find more than 10, 12 anemic, bloodless-looking specimens. Evidently some blight or distemper, perhaps sprung from the unwholesome pasture of the diseased fungi and timbers of the filthy barn, caused a heavy mortality among the Whateley animals. Old wounds and sores, having something of the aspect of incisions, seemed to afflict the visible cattle, and once or twice during the earlier months certain callers fancied they could even discern similar sores about the throats of the gray, unshaven old man and his slantingly crinkled-haired albino daughter. In the spring, after Wilbur's birth, Lavinia resumed her customary rambles in the hills, bearing in her misproportioned arms and swarthy child. Public interest in the Waterley subsided after most of the country folk had seen the baby, and no one bothered to comment on the swift development which the newcomer seemed every day to exhibit. Wilbur's growth was indeed phenomenal, for within 3 months of his birth he had attained a size and muscular power not usually found in infants under a full year of age. His motions and even his vocal sounds showed a restraint and deliberate highly peculiar and infinite, and no one was really unprepared when, at 7 months, he began to walk unassisted, with father limbs which another month was sufficient to remove. And what was some time after, on All Halloweens, that a great blaze was seen at midnight on the top of Sentient Hill, where the old table-like stone stands amidst its tumbles of ancient bones. Considerable talk was started when Silas Bishop, of the undecayed bishops, mentioned having seen the boy running superbly up the hill ahead of his mother about an hour before the blaze was remarked. Silas was rounding up a stray heifer, but he nearly forgot his mission. When he fleetingly spied the two figures in the dim light of his lantern, they darted almost noisily through the underbrush, and the astonished watcher seemed to think that they were entirely unclothed. Afterwards he could not be sure about the boy, who had some kind of frame belt and a pair of dark trunks or trousers on. Wilbur was never subsequently seen alive and conscious without complete and tightly buttoned attire, and disarrangement or threatened or disagreements of which only seemed to fill him with anger and alarm. His contrast with his squalid mother and grandfather and the respect was thoroughly very notable until the horror of 1928 suggested the most valid of reasons. Next January, gossips were mildly interested in the fact that the Lavanry's darker brat has commenced to talk, and at the age of only 11 months his speech was somewhat remarkable, both because of his differences from the ordinary accents of the region, and because it displayed a freedom from infantile lisping of which many children of 3 or 4 might be proud of. The boy was not talkative yet. When he spoke, he seemed to reflect some elusive element wholly unpossessed by Dunwich and his denizens. The strangeness did not reside in what he said, or even in the simple idioms he used, but seemed vaguely linked with his annotations of what the internal organs that produced the spoken sounds. His facial aspect, too, was remarkable for its maturity, for though he shared his mother's and grandfather's chinlessness, his firm and precociously shaped nose united with the expression of his large, dark, almost Latin eyes, to give him the air of quasi-adulthood and well-nigh perpetual intelligence. He was, however, exceedingly ugly despite his appearance of brilliancy, there being something almost goatish or animalistic about his thick lips, large-pored, yellowish skin, coarse, crinkly hair, and oddly elongated ears. He was soon disliked even more decidedly of his mother and grandsire, and all conjectures about him were spiced with reference to the bygones of magic of the old whateley, and how the hills once shook and shrieked the dreadful name of Young Sobloff in the midst of a circle of stones, with a great book open in the arms before him. Dogs abhorred the boy, and he was always obligated to take various defense measures against their barking menace. Chapter 3. Meanwhile, old Whatley continued to buy cattle, with measurably increasing the size of the herd. He also cut timber, and began to repair the unused parts of his house, a spacious peak-roof affair, whose rear end was buried entirely in the rocky hillside, and whose 3 least-roomed ground-floor rooms had always been sufficient for himself and his daughter. There must have been prodigious reserves of strength in the old man to enable him to accomplish so much hard labor, and though he still babbled dementedly at times, his carpentry seemed to show the effect of sound calculation. It had already begun to look as soon as Wilbur was born. Many tool sheds had been put suddenly in order, clapboards and fitted with a stout fresh look. Now in restoring the abandoned upper story of the house, he was in no less thorough of a craftsman. His mania showed itself only in tight bounding up of all the windows in the reclaimed section, though many declared that it was a crazy thing to bother with the reclamation of it all. Less inexplicable was his fitting up of the other downstairs room for his new grandson, a room which several callers saw, though no one was ever admittedly close to the boarding upper story. The chamber he had lined with tall, firm shelving, along which he began gradually to arrange, in apparently a careful order, all the rotting ancient books and parts of books which during his own day had been helped previously in odd corners of various rooms. "I made some use of 'em," he would say, as he tried to mend a torn black leather page with paste on the rusty kitchen stove. "But the boy's fitting to make better use of 'em. He ought to have 'em was sort of a kid, and then they're going to be all of them the larnin'." When Wilbur was a year and 7 months old in September of 1914, his size and accomplishments were almost alarming. He had grown as large as a child of 4, and was fluent with incredibly an intelligent talker. He ran freely about the fields and hills and accompanied his mother on all her wanderings. At home, he would pore diligently over the queer pictures and charts in his grandfather's books, while old Whitley would instruct and catechize him through long, hushed afternoons. By this time the restoration of the house was finished, and those who watched it wondered why one of the upper windows had been made into a solid plank door. It was a window in the rear of the east gable end, close against the hill, and no one could imagine why a cleated wooden runway was built up to it from the ground. About the period of this work completion, people noticed that the old tool house, tightly locked, windowless, clapboard since Wilbur's birth, had been abandoned again. The door swung listlessly open, and when Earl Sawyer once stepped within after a cattle-selling call on old Whitley, he was quite discomposed by a singular odor he encountered. Such a stench, he averred, he had never smelled it in all his life, except near the Indian circles on the hill, in which he could not come from anything sane or of this earth. But then, the homes and the sheds of Dunwich folk have never been remarkable for olfactory inclemency. The following months were void of visible events, save that everyone swore to a slow but steady increase of mysterious hill noise. On May Eve of 1915, there were tremors, which even the Aylesbury people felt, whilst following Halloween produced an underground rambling queerly synchronized with bursts of flames. Then witch Whateley's doings from the summit of Scented Hill. Wilbur was growing up uncannily, so that he looked like a boy of 10 as he entered his 4th year. He read avidly by himself, but talked much less than formerly. A settled tincture was absorbing him, and for the first time people began to speak specially of the drawling look of evil in his goatish face. He would sometimes mutter an unfamiliar jargon and chant in bizarre rhythms, which called the listener with a sense of unexplained terror. The aversion displayed towards him by dogs had now become a matter of wide remark, and he was obligated to carry a pistol in order to traverse the countryside in safety. His occasional use of the weapon did not enhance his popularity amongst the owners of canine guardians. The few callers at the house would often find Lavinia alone on the ground floor, while odd cries and footsteps resounded in the boarded-up 2nd story. She would never tell what her father and the boy were doing up there, though once she turned pale and displayed an abnormal degree of fear when a jocose fish peddler tried to go near the locked door leading to the stairway. That peddler told the store lounger at Dunwich Village that he thought he heard a horse stamping on the floor above. The loungers reflected, thinking of the door and the runway and of the cattle, and so swiftly disappeared, that they shuddered as they recalled the tales of old Wadley's youth, and the strange things that they are called out of the earth when the bullock is sacrificed at the proper time to certain heathen gods. It had for some time been noticed that the dogs had begun to hate and fear the whole Whateley place as violently as they hated and feared young Wilbur's personally. In 1917 the war came, and Squire Sawyer Whateley, as chairman of the local draft board, had hard working finding a quota of the young Dunwich men fit even to be sent to a development camp. The government, alarmed at such times of a wholesale regional decadence, sent several officers and medical experts to investigate, conducting a survey which New England newspaper readers may still recall. It was publicly attending the investigation which set reporters on the track of the Whateleys and caused the Boston Globe Arkham Advisor to print flamboyant Sunday stories of young Wilbur's precocious tales, old Whateley's black magic, and the shelves of strange books that sealed 2nd story of the ancient farmhouse and the weirdness of the whole region and its hill noise. Wilbur was 4.5 then, and looked like a lad of 15. His lips and cheeks were fuzzy with a coarse dark brown, and his voice had begun to break. Earl Sawyer went out to Whateley's place with both sets of reporters and cameramen, and called to the attention to the queer stench which should now seem to trickle down from the sealed upper space. It was, he said, exactly like a smell he had found in a tool shed abandoned when the house was finally repaired, and like the faint odors when he sometimes thought he caught near the stone circles of the mountains. Dunwich folk read the stories when they appear and grinned over the obvious mistakes. They wondered, too, why the writers made such a fuss over the fact that old Whateleys always paid for his cattle in gold pieces of extremely ancient date. The Whateleys had received their visitors with ill-concealed distaste, though they did not court further publicly by a violent resistance or refusal to talk. I feel like that's a good place to leave off. We'll be picking up with chapter 4. So far we've learned that the Dunwich Horror is tied to some more Neanderthal-like people that have a child that is goat-like, if you could call it a child. It was dated that 1927 is when the Dunwich Horror took place. Once we left off in chapter 3, we were nearing that. So, tune in next time to find out more, and feel free to leave your hypothesis and comments in the description below. I also hope that the scripture I read at the beginning gives you an idea of how we talk about old nymphs, werewolves, and stuff like that. There's stories that are beyond us that repeat in culture that may equate to something that others have seen. Much like this demonic goat boy, Wilbur, his name is. Kind of like Wilbur the pig. It's kind of funny if you think about it. But feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and tune in next week for chapter 4. For now, bye-bye.